So today I want to go over the brand new Eleventy version 2 release, kind of some of the new things that went into the release, and just kind of highlighting the things that we've been working on in the last year. And then at the end, I'll go over a little bit about what's coming next for Eleventy. So yeah. One of the big things that went into the version 2 release is that we really put on a lot of work at reducing our dependency count. So version 2 had 311 dependencies, which if you're a fan of the band 311, maybe you like that number better. But in the new 2.0 release, we have 211 dependencies. So just reducing our dependency count really has some cascading effects in the project. And I think maybe the biggest thing is it makes Eleventy more secure. So we're reducing the number of third-party dependencies that we're using in the project, dependencies that are outside of our control. And we're really reducing the attack surface for Eleventy projects because there's less code outside of the Eleventy community or outside the Eleventy project that we don't have control over. Really, what prompted this originally was we were really trying to look at how do we decrease the number of NPM audits that come back. So vulnerabilities that come back when you install Eleventy for the first time. Now, controversially, some alternative frameworks hide these in their project creation, and you can read more about that on my website. I don't really want to call anybody out in this one, but I do think those are important to know the security footprint of your project and if it has any outstanding security vulnerabilities. But right now we're sitting at 0 NPM audits. So I think that it's had some very good results in terms of trying to make Eleventy more secure. And practically speaking, our node modules folder really shrunk quite a bit with this change. And most of this is because we rewrote the dev server. We moved away from browser sync as being bundled as a part of Eleventy core. And now we have our own internal Eleventy dev server that we maintain. So instead of 155 megabytes showing up inside of your project's node folder when you install Eleventy, now we're at 34 megabyte, which I think is great. And just to compare to some existing alternative frameworks in this space, Next.js is about 150, Astra is about 169, and then Gatsby and Remix are kind of the outliers, getting up there into 500 megabyte of node modules weight when you install their projects. And that can be unexpected, I think, for folks that are trying out a new project. They don't really expect that they'll use up half a gigabyte of space when they install an NPM module. And also practically, this means that you can install Eleventy faster. So just some sample benchmarks in the Eleventy version 1 project, it was about 7.4 seconds to install Eleventy. And in version 2, it's only about 5 seconds. This is from a completely cleared NPM cache. You probably won't see it take this long. But yeah, if you start over from scratch with no previous Eleventy installs on your machine, it'll take about 5 seconds. And just to compare across the space, Astra will take about 12.5 seconds. Gatsby is, again, Gatsby and Remix with those larger node modules folders really do take a lot longer to install. Now, the outlier here is Next.js. They actually embed all their dependencies right into their project. They don't use NPM to manage those dependencies for them, which is great. And then it speeds up your NPM install, but you do not get the sort of ecosystem benefits from NPM in terms of reporting vulnerabilities. So if Next.js has a vulnerability in their project, you won't see it in an NPM audit because they do just sort of inline or bundle that dependency code right in their project. As always, Eleventy has no telemetry built in. Now, telemetry is a mechanism that some frameworks use to track usage. So when you run commands for a framework, it may be phoning those commands back to a central server, which isn't necessarily a terrible thing if folks are aware of it. But Eleventy doesn't have any of this built in. We don't require you to opt out of this. We have no telemetry or tracking built in. One of the great practical features that came from this version 2 release is that we have much better incremental build support. Finally, I think a lot of folks have been waiting on this for a while. Now, previously in Eleventy in the version 1 release and previous versions that had that sort of lower fidelity incremental build support, if you edited a page in your input folder, it would actually rebuild only that page, which was great. So if you were just working on a single template or a single content page, you could use that incremental build to only rebuild that one page. And that worked great and fine. But with the version 2 release, our incremental builds got a little smarter. So if you edit a layout page or layout file, we only rebuild the content pages or the routes that use that layout file. So it's a little bit smarter. If you edit a component, so we have this new WebC sort of HTML first component file format that I'm going to talk about a little bit more later. If you edit an individual component, we only rebuild the pages that use that component. So even smarter. And if you edit a page that's in a collection, and that collection is then consumed by another template that uses it via pagination, or we have this new front matter property called Eleventy import to sort of declare those dependencies manually, we'll only rebuild the pages that apply in those cases. So just as an example, on this build showing here, I edit a blog post, and in the Eleventy documentation site, it only rebuilds and writes 2 files. So those 2 files are the index page, because we have a highlighted blogs section on the index page that shows some of the latest blog posts, and then the blog index page, which iterates over the blog posts to list them all out. So just a smarter way of doing incremental builds that doesn't require you to rebuild your entire project. Just save you a little bit of time. And this is what that Eleventy import declaration might look like. So inside of any page where you're using a different collection and you want to rebuild that whenever a blog post changes, this is what it looks like in that project. Now, perhaps confusingly, this is using a third-party front matter format, which is the JavaScript front matter, which will be coming in future versions of Eleventy. We'll probably bundle it together. But yeah, you'll probably need to use YAML or JS or the existing JSON front matter formats for that. And there are more examples of that on the documentation site. Another command line flag that came in Eleventy version 2 is ignore initial. And that works great with incremental builds. So when you use those 2 commands together, you can see on the top example here, we're just running incremental. And what an incremental build up front is, it does a full Eleventy build just to start out, just to get a good baseline start of your project, to get it in a good state for incremental builds that come later. And that's important, because if you have edited files while the Eleventy build hasn't run or is not running actively, we won't know to apply those changes. But if you can pretty much guarantee that you haven't edited any files or made changes to your content in your project, you can run ignore initial, and we'll skip that initial build altogether, and we'll only apply incremental builds moving forward. So if you make changes to your content pages or your layouts, as I just previously explained, we'll apply those incremental builds. So yeah, it's just kind of a way to give you more control over the initial startup process and whether or not to run that full build to get your project in a good state. I think one of the confusing features that we sort of disabled by default right before the official full version 2 release of Eleventy, we had this feature called emulated pass-through copy. So it was a way to, while you're running the dev server locally, just fake the pass-through copy. So it doesn't actually copy any pass-through copy files to your output folder. And in the top example here, you can see how it works by default in Eleventy today. We'll copy all your pass-through copy files. And you can see that in this project, there's almost 7,000 pass-through copy files on the Eleventy documentation. But if you use this new emulated pass-through copy feature, we don't copy any of those files to your output folder, and we handle those in the dev server for you automatically. So it really allows you to speed up your build by not copying those files locally while you're doing your local development. And we do not use that when you're doing a full build in your production server. So it's just another thing that can speed up your local development time. As I kind of mentioned before, we have a new dev server in Eleventy version 2. It's really quite a bit smaller than our previous browser sync dependency. It doesn't have any bundler built into it. It's super fast to start up. It has live reload that's WebSockets based. And we actually have a DOM diffing HTML updating feature. So it has all of the live updating features that you would expect from a dev server, but yeah, in a much smaller package. Yeah, and I think it's great. I'm really excited about it. And I think that is really one of the best features that went into the version 2 release. Another big thing that went into version 2 is that we got rid of this indented markdown blocks feature. I think it's one of, maybe in my opinion, one of the most hated markdown features. It's just a syntax way of saying in a markdown file, if you indent a block of content to 4 or more spaces, it will make that into a code block. And it was really, I think, unpredictable for a lot of folks. A lot of folks didn't really understand what was happening, especially when you start to use things like shortcodes in your Markdown files, which may or may not have extra indentation on them. So we've gotten rid of that feature by default in Eleventy version 2. And folks have been very happy with that change. I think it was universally. I put up a poll to see whether or not we should do this, and I didn't hear one person that wasn't in favor of making this change. So yeah, that's new in version 2. And most folks shouldn't be aware of this because the unpredictability is now gone. So things should be more predictable in Markdown. As Lena mentioned, we do have a few additional default configuration files that we look for. There's a certain order that we look for these files. So it only uses the first one that it finds. So if you have, by accident, have a bunch of configuration files in your project, just know that we look for the .eleventy.js one first. And yeah, now we look for eleventy.config.js. And if you're using an ESM project, you can also use eleventy.config.cjs for your configuration file. Yeah, and we'll look for those by default. Now you can, of course, always pass in the configuration path name with the --config command line flag. If you want to use a different one, the option is available to you. Another cool thing that we added is async support for add shortcode. So if you want to add a shortcode that is async friendly, previously you had to, I believe there was a separate method to do this. It was add async shortcode. Now we're sort of centralized on one single method for that. We're keeping the other one around for backwards compatibility, but yeah, I think this will sort of simplify things for folks so we don't have to always look up those method names. Add filter is also async friendly now. So if you want to do asynchronous things inside of add filter, you can now do that. Now, notably, if you do this, some template syntaxes are not async friendly. So previously, if you call add filter without an asynchronous or a promise-based callback, then it will apply to all the async friendly and non-async friendly universal template syntaxes. So practically, this just means that it doesn't work in handlebars. Handlebars is the only one that gets left out if you're using promise-based or async callback functions here for add filter and add shortcode, because handlebars isn't async friendly and it can't do async stuff. So yep, that's the big change there. We did some consistency work around what's available inside of the context of shortcodes, filters, linters, and transforms. You can now access this.page and this.eleventy in filters, linters, and transforms now. We previously had those in shortcodes. Now this feature, custom data formats, is not a new thing in Eleventy version 2. It was available in many previous versions of Eleventy. It allowed you to add your own custom file extension for the data cascade. So files we look for in the data cascade and in global data and template and directory data files as well. And so this is just an example of how to add support for TOML to do that inside of the data cascade. And I just wanted to use this as a way to introduce the new feature that we have in Eleventy version 2. You can actually feed binary files into the data cascade too. So this is kind of a weird one that most folks probably won't use, but I think it's kind of interesting. Here's an example of how to feed images into the data cascade. So this uses EXIF metadata to parse PNG and JPEG images and feed that EXIF metadata back into the data cascade for use on your templates. So if you had some images that you wanted to automatically be available to your templates and your template data, you could use this mechanism to do that. I thought it was kind of, just kind of an interesting power user feature that maybe some folks weren't aware of. We actually have a lot more official Eleventy plugins now with version 2. So we have an Edge plugin that's brand new. We have an internationalization plugin. We have a base plugin, which sort of supersedes the URL filter, and that's tied into path prefixing. So if you want this, that's like a lot. Those three things together are a lot, I know, but if you want to deploy your Eleventy project to a different subfolder, you would use the base plugin to do that. And that makes it pretty easy to do that moving forward with path prefix. And we also have a Vite plugin. So if you're interested in using the Vite bundler with Eleventy, you can use that as well. Now, one of the most exciting things that I am sort of working on actively in Eleventy world right now is our new WebC file format and the WebC plugin for Eleventy. Now, WebC is sort of a way to bring HTML first components to Eleventy. And WebC can run independent of Eleventy, but just for the context of this talk, I'll sort of be focusing on the Eleventy plugin for WebC. So it really allows you to have components in your projects and use a component development strategy, which I think is great for larger projects that have a ton of different content and different styles of content that might exist across your site. And client JavaScript is 100% optional inside of these components. You don't have to have any client-side JavaScript if you don't want. It also allows you to do things like single file components. So if you're familiar with the Vue plugin that we had before, or if you like Vue single file components, or if you like Svelte components, you may be familiar with these single file component structure. It really allows you to put your CSS and your JavaScript right next to your content HTML as well. And yeah, I'm really a big fan of it. I like having all of those things sort of together and organized together in my projects, and it makes for editing projects long-term much easier. And all of the CSS and JavaScript management is bundled or built in with Eleventy WebC. So if you include a style block in a WebC component, or if you reference an external style sheet, we'll sort of bundle all of that CSS for you. And the same thing for client-side JavaScript as well. So it really reuses a lot of the existing HTML conventions that folks are already familiar with and packages them up in a nice way. Now, folks that are familiar with islands architecture, and I think a thing that maybe Astro has popularized, we have our own island web component that we supply for this. You can use island. We do have a WebC component for island that sort of bundles the client JavaScript for you for that web component. And yeah, I think that this unlocks some really sort of neat larger page use cases where you can sort of lazy load different sections of the page in a very interesting way. Islands architecture is just kind of spicy lazy loading, and I think that there's a lot of marketing around that, and yeah, that's just kind of how I think about it. So I think another unique thing about WebC is that it's fully async friendly, and I think that I may lose my mind if React comes out with like full async support across the board in JSX, and because it seems like something that should have been bundled from a very long time. And WebC does include full incremental support down to individual component use. So we have a full dependency graph of all the components that exist in your project, and we know where those components are used on and on what pages. So we can smartly rebuild only the pages that apply when you make a component code change. And Shadow DOM is kind of like this web components thing that is kind of controversial in an interesting way. I think that Shadow DOM was maybe oversold as something that needed to be used as part of web components, and WebC really allows you to use that if you want to, but I think the unique thing about using WebC components is that you can hoist content back to just be nested inside of a custom element if you want. So you don't have to use Shadow DOM. Now, declarative Shadow DOM is the thing that's coming that will sort of unlock all of these things for Shadow DOM use cases. But I think that all three of these mechanisms will probably still be relevant moving forward. The great thing about using WebC for generating HTML is that you can just declare a single component tag, and we'll include a bunch of content as children of that tag without using Shadow DOM for you if you want. So it really allows you to author components in a much more streamlined way, and you can sort of toggle Shadow DOM on or off as you want inside of the component definition. And I'm going to have some more videos surrounding that moving forward to make that clear. I think that, yeah, I didn't probably introduce enough fundamentals for this slide and this talk, and I apologize for that, but it is something that I'm going to be sort of introducing more and talking more about, especially as declarative Shadow DOM gets additional browser support. I think the only browser that's missing it right now is Firefox. So you'll start to see more discussions around that when Firefox gets that support. I did want to just include a few slides about what is next for Eleventy, what I'm working on next. As I mentioned, I'm really sort of working very hard with WebC, really trying to make it as fast as possible, make the authoring experience great. Yeah, WebC is kind of taking up a lot of development bandwidth right now, and I think it's great. I think it's going to be a very interesting way to build things moving forward in a very lightweight way that doesn't require any client-side JavaScript, so I'm very excited about that. I think the other thing that folks really ask me about a lot is how can we improve our documentation? I think that the documentation is starting to show, or is very clearly showing, some of its age. Eleventy is a 4 or 5 year old project, and we haven't really done a holistic view at restructuring our documentation to fit beginners in the Eleventy space better. And I think that there's a lot of work that we can do to improve that. Yeah, I think you'll start to see more iterations on the docs being shipped here in coming weeks. And the other thing is Eleventy version 3. So folks that have been using 2.0 in the Canary releases for a while kind of understand that in Eleventy world, we do those sort of quicker release Canary branch releases for many months before we'll go stable or beta. And in that same vein, I think that I would like to get an Eleventy v3 Canary up in the next 1 or 2 months that includes full support for ECMAScript modules. I think that that is a big feature that folks have really asked for, and a lot of folks are sort of waiting on it. Now you can use Eleventy in an ESM project today, just your configuration file cannot be ESM. And I think the Eleventy JavaScript template syntax format is maybe not ESM friendly today. So we want to get some of those mechanisms smoothed over, and we'll do that in the v3 Canary. Yeah. And so that will be a big thing coming in v3. And that's it.